The storm tore across the cliffside road, and Odessa Hale heard it before she saw it. A low, broken whimper carried on the wind, rising over the crash of rain against stone. She ran toward the sound, her lantern swinging wildly, until the light caught something enormous crouched at the very edge of the cliff. A dog. Not any dog. A Cane Corso, its massive frame trembling, its clouded eyes wide and unseeing, one paw already hanging over open air. "No," Odessa breathed, dropping the lantern and lunging forward. "Don't move. Please don't move." The animal turned its head toward her voice, sightless and terrified, its whole body shaking as the ground crumbled beneath its front paw. She threw her arms around its neck and pulled with everything she had, both of them collapsing backward onto solid earth just as a chunk of the cliff broke away and vanished into the dark. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the dog pressed its massive head against her shoulder, and Odessa realized she was crying. Torches appeared through the rain moments later, men shouting a name she didn't recognize. "Magnus! Magnus! Where are you?" A rider broke from the group, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped, and Odessa found herself staring up at a man whose fear had not yet turned to relief. His coat was soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and when his eyes found the dog alive in her arms, something in his face nearly broke. "You saved him," he said, his voice unsteady. "You saved my dog." Odessa had no idea, in that moment, who he truly was, or what those words would come to mean for the rest of her life. She could not have imagined that within weeks, the stranger kneeling in the mud beside his blind companion would look at her the way he was looking at her now, and speak words no one, least of all her, ever expected to hear. If you're already wondering what happens next, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Like this video if you're rooting for Odessa already, and subscribe for more stories like. The rain had not eased by the time they reached Deerholt Manor. Odessa sat wrapped in a borrowed cloak inside the Duke's carriage, Magnus stretched across the floor between them, his great head resting against her knee as though he refused to be parted from her even for a moment. Across from her sat the Duke, silent, his eyes fixed on the dog with an intensity that made her feel as though she were intruding on something private. She studied him carefully now that the panic had drained from his face. He was younger than she expected for a man with such authority in his voice, and there was a rawness to him that no title could disguise. "You still haven't told me your name," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Odessa Hale," she answered. "My father tends the hedgerows at Marrow Fields, 2 miles east of here." "Tobias Renshaw," he said, "though most call me by less pleasant names when I've made them wait in the rain." A faint smile crossed her lips despite herself. Magnus stirred at the sound of his voice, tail thumping weakly against the carriage floor. "He knows you're frightened," Odessa said. "Dogs feel these things more than people realize." "He has always known more than he should," Tobias murmured, reaching down to rest his hand against the dog's flank. "He went blind 18 months ago. Fever. The physician said he would likely have to be put down, that a blind dog his size would be a danger to himself and everyone around him. I refused to hear it." "You were right to refuse. Tonight I nearly proved myself a fool for it," he said quietly. "One of the stable boys left the east gate open. Magnus has never wandered that far before. If you hadn't been walking that road at that exact hour." He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The carriage rolled through iron gates moments later, and Deerholt Manor rose out of the storm like something carved from the night itself, its windows glowing gold against the black sky, its stone towers disappearing into low clouds. Odessa had passed this estate 100 times in her life and never once imagined she would enter through its front doors. A woman was waiting on the steps before the carriage had fully stopped, an older woman with sharp eyes and a posture that spoke of decades spent commanding a household. She rushed forward the moment the door opened. "Your Grace, thank heaven," she said, then stopped short at the sight of Magnus being carried through the rain in a stranger's arms. What in the world happened? "He nearly went over the cliff at Harlan's Ridge," Tobias said. "This is Miss Hale." She pulled him back from the edge. The housekeeper's expression shifted from alarm to something closer to disbelief as she looked at Odessa properly for the first time, taking in her soaked dress and the mud clinging to her hem. "Mrs. Winch," the housekeeper said, extending a hand that was warmer than her sharp eyes suggested. "Come inside before you catch your death. Both of you." Inside, the manor was a blur of firelight and hurried footsteps. A physician was summoned for Magnus, though it was quickly determined the dog had suffered nothing worse than a scraped paw and exhaustion. Odessa was given dry clothes, a private room to change in, and a cup of something warm that tasted of honey and brandy, and through it all she kept waiting for someone to tell her it was time to leave. No one did. She found Tobias later in a long gallery lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, sitting on the floor beside Magnus with his back against the wall, looking nothing like a duke at all. "You should be resting," she said from the doorway. "I could say the same of you." He glanced up, and something in his face eased slightly at the sight of her, though he seemed to catch himself doing it. "Sit with us a while if you're willing. He hasn't stopped watching the door since you left the room. I think he's afraid you won't come back. Dogs can't see doors when they're blind, Your Grace." "No," he agreed, "but they can feel who walks through them." She sat, and for a long while neither of them spoke, the fire crackling low in the hearth while Magnus dozed between them, one paw resting against her ankle as though anchoring her there. "How long has he been without his sight?" she asked eventually. 18 months, as I said, though if I'm honest, I think some part of him has adjusted better than I have." Tobias ran a hand through his damp hair. "My father raised him from a pup, gave him to me the year before he died. When Magnus went blind, everyone told me to let him go. My steward, my physician, even my own mother before she passed." His jaw tightened. "I couldn't do it. He was the last thing my father ever gave me that still felt alive." "Then you understand him better than any of them did." "Perhaps." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her feel suddenly aware of every damp strand of hair clinging to her neck. "Tell me something, Miss Hale. What were you doing on that road in that storm at that hour?" The question caught her off guard, and for a moment she considered lying, giving some simple answer about an errand or a late return home. But something about the honesty already exchanged between them made deception feel unworthy. "I was walking away from a proposal I had no intention of accepting," she admitted. "A merchant's son from the village. My father favors the match. I do not. And why not? Because he has never once asked what I want. He only tells me what I should be grateful for." She met the Duke's eyes. "I would rather be alone in a storm than trapped in a warm house with a man who cannot see me at all." Something shifted in Tobias's expression, quiet and startled, as though she had said something he had not expected a stranger to understand. "That," he said slowly, "is a remarkably similar complaint to one I hold about most of the company I keep." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed down the gallery, and a young man appeared at the far end, dressed finely despite the late hour, his expression sharpening the moment he saw them seated together on the floor. "Tobias!" His voice was smooth, but there was an edge beneath it. "I heard there was some commotion with the dog." I came as soon as I could. Gideon. Tobias rose, brushing off his coat. There was an incident. Miss Hale saved Magnus' life tonight. Gideon's eyes moved over Odessa with an assessment so quick and so thorough that she felt it like a physical touch. How fortunate, he said, his tone giving nothing away. A village girl, wandering the cliffs in a storm, arriving just in time to save the Duke's dog. Quite the stroke of luck. It wasn't luck, Odessa said evenly. It was a dog about to die and someone nearby who couldn't walk past that. Gideon's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes went cold and calculating in a way that made the back of her neck prickle. Of course, he said. Forgive me. It has simply been a strange night. First the gate left open, which has never happened in all the years I've visited this house, and now a stranger appearing at exactly the right moment. Is there something you wish to say, Gideon? Tobias asked, his voice carrying a warning she hadn't heard from him before. Only that I find these things worth noticing, Gideon said lightly. Good night, Tobias. Miss Hale. He turned and disappeared back down the gallery, his footsteps unhurried, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Who is he? Odessa asked once he was gone. A friend of my late father's family. He visits often. Tobias's jaw was tight, his gaze lingering on the empty doorway. Pay him no mind. But Odessa noticed the way his hand had curled into a fist at his side, and she found herself wondering, for the first time that night, whether the open gate at Harlan's Ridge had truly been an accident at all. Morning arrived pale and washed clean, the storm having stripped the sky of clouds overnight. Odessa woke in an unfamiliar bed in one of the manor's guest rooms, sunlight pooling across sheets finer than anything she had ever slept in, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then she heard the soft, unmistakable sound of a large dog snoring somewhere nearby, and everything came rushing back. Magnus lay curled at the foot of her bed, having apparently refused to leave her side sometime in the night. She sat up carefully, not wanting to disturb him, but his ears twitched at the shift in the mattress and his tail thumped once against the blankets. You're a terrible guard dog, she murmured, reaching down to scratch behind his ear. You're supposed to protect the Duke, not abandon him for a stranger's bed. A knock sounded at the door before she could say more, and Mrs. Winch entered with a tray of tea and a folded gown draped over her arm. His Grace requests your company at breakfast, Miss Hale, whenever you're ready, the housekeeper said, setting the tray down. And he insisted you take this. Said your own dress would need mending before it's fit to wear again. Odessa touched the fabric, soft and clearly expensive, and felt a flush of discomfort. I couldn't possibly accept. You saved that dog's life, Mrs. Winch said firmly, cutting her off. And more than that, you've done something for His Grace that half the physicians in this county couldn't manage. I haven't seen that man smile properly in over a year, not since his mother passed. He smiled at you 3 times last night. I counted. The words settled into Odessa's chest with a warmth she wasn't prepared for, and she found herself dressing with unsteady hands, more nervous about breakfast with the Duke than she had been about pulling a dog from the edge of a cliff. She found Tobias in a sunlit breakfast room, Magnus already stationed loyally beside his chair, and the sight of him in daylight struck her differently than it had the night before. The exhaustion had eased from his face, and there was an openness to him now that felt almost boyish, entirely at odds with the grand portraits lining the manor's halls. You look well rested, he said, rising slightly as she entered, a courtesy she hadn't expected. I slept better than I have in months, she admitted, though I suspect that has more to do with your dog stealing half my bed than the quality of the mattress. Tobias laughed, a real laugh, and Magnus' tail thumped against the floor as though pleased with himself. They ate together, and the conversation moved easily between them in a way that surprised her, touching on everything from the running of the estate to the strange comfort of a blind dog who seemed to know exactly where everyone in a room stood without ever needing to look. Odessa found herself relaxing, forgetting for long stretches that she was speaking with a duke at all. It was Gideon's arrival, halfway through the meal, that shattered the ease of it. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, though nothing in his tone suggested regret. He took a seat without waiting to be asked, his gaze settling on Odessa with the same assessing coldness from the night before. "I trust you slept well, Miss Hale, after your heroics." "I did, thank you. How fortunate that you happened to know these cliffs so well in the dark," Gideon continued, spreading jam across a piece of toast with deliberate slowness. "Not everyone could navigate that path safely in a storm." "I've walked that road since I was a child," Odessa said evenly. "I know every stone in it." "Of course." Gideon's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's simply remarkable timing, is all I mean to say. The gate left open, you appearing at exactly that moment. One might almost think it was arranged." The words hit the table like a dropped glass, and Tobias's fork went still against his plate. "Gideon," he said, his voice low and hard, "if you have something to accuse Miss Hale of, say it plainly. Don't circle it like a vulture." "I accuse no one of anything," Gideon said smoothly, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I only think it wise to remember that not everyone who arrives at a fortunate moment does so by chance. Your father taught me that caution, if you recall. He was careful about who he let close to this family." "My father is dead," Tobias said, "and I make my own judgments now." A tense silence stretched across the table, broken only by Magnus shifting restlessly beneath Tobias's chair, his blind eyes turning toward the sound of raised voices as though he could sense the danger in them even without sight. Gideon rose, unbothered, dabbing at his mouth with a napkin. "As you say, Tobias, I only want what's best for this family, as I always have." His eyes flicked once more to Odessa before he left the room. "A pleasure, Miss Hale. I do hope your father's hedgerows are thriving." The mention of her father, so specific and unnecessary, sent a chill through her. She had told no one at this house where her father worked. She had told only Tobias, and only the night before, in the privacy of the gallery. Once Gideon's footsteps faded, Tobias exhaled slowly and pushed a hand through his hair. "I apologize for that." "How did he know about my father?" Odessa asked. "I only mentioned that to you." Tobias's expression shifted, the color draining slightly from his face as the same realization settled over him. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I didn't tell him." "Then how?" "I don't know, Odessa." Her name, spoken plainly for the first time without title or formality, seemed to surprise them both. "But I intend to find out." He stood and crossed to the window, looking out over the grounds where the gardens stretched toward the cliffs in the distance. The same cliffs that had nearly claimed Magnus' life less than a day before. "Gideon has never liked the idea of me marrying," he said quietly. "He has spent the better part of 2 years steering me toward matches that would keep certain arrangements intact between our families. Arrangements my father made before he died. Ones I never agreed to." "What kind of arrangements?" "The kind that would leave Gideon managing a considerable portion of this estate's affairs, regardless of who I marry, so long as I marry someone he approves of." Tobias turned back to face her, his jaw tight. "I've refused every candidate he's suggested for the past year. He's grown desperate." "You think he left that gate open on purpose? That he endangered Magnus' life just to—" She stopped, the horror of the implication catching in her throat. "I don't know what to think," Tobias admitted. "But I know Magnus has never wandered in 18 months of blindness. Not once. And I know Gideon was the last person seen near the stables yesterday evening." Magnus whined softly, pressing his head against Tobias's leg as though he understood every word being spoken above him. And Odessa felt a cold certainty settle into her chest that whatever had happened on that cliff the night before, it had not been an accident at all. "I want to help you find out the truth," she said. Tobias studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You've already given more to this house in one night than most people give in years," he said quietly. "I won't ask you to risk anything further." "You didn't ask," Odessa said. "I'm offering." For the first time since Gideon had left the room, Tobias smiled, small and genuine, and Magnus' tail thumped once against the floor as though he, too, approved of the answer. The stables smelled of hay and leather, and Odessa moved through them slowly, running her fingers along the wooden stalls while Tobias walked a few paces ahead, questioning the stable hands one by one. Magnus padded beside her, his nose lifted to catch every scent the morning air carried, more animated than she had seen him since the storm. "Nothing," Tobias said, returning to her side with frustration carved into his face. "No one admits to touching that gate. No one saw Gideon near the stables at all, according to them." "Someone is lying," Odessa said. "Gates don't open themselves." They had spent the better part of the morning retracing the events of the previous night, and every path led to the same maddening dead end. The stable hands were loyal, frightened, or both, and none of them would meet Tobias's eyes for longer than a moment before looking away. A young groom lingered near the far stall, watching them with an expression that flickered between curiosity and unease. Odessa noticed him first, the way his hands twisted the edge of his sleeve, the way he kept glancing toward the manor house as though expecting someone to appear. "You," she said gently, walking toward him. "What's your name?" "Rein, miss." He couldn't have been more than 16, thin and wiry, his eyes darting between her and Tobias. "Run. Did you see anything unusual last night? Anyone near the east gate before the storm broke?" The boy hesitated, his throat working as he swallowed. Tobias stepped closer, his voice softening from the sharp authority he'd used with the others. "Whatever it is," he said, "you won't be punished for telling me the truth. I give you my word." Ren glanced once more toward the manor, then lowered his voice. "There was a man, Your Grace. I didn't see his face clearly, it was already growing dark, but he wasn't one of the stable hands. He wore a fine coat, finer than any of us could afford. I saw him near the east gate just before supper, and when I went back an hour later to check the horses, the latch was already open." "Did you tell anyone this?" Tobias asked. "I was afraid to, sir. Mr. Corliss said if any of us spoke ill of the family's guests, we'd lose our positions." Ren's voice trembled slightly. "I need this work. My mother's ill, and there's no one else to." "You'll keep your position," Tobias said firmly. "You have my word on that as well. Thank you for telling me." Ren nodded, relief loosening his shoulders, and hurried back to his duties before anyone else could see him speaking so openly. Odessa turned to Tobias once the boy was out of earshot. "Corliss, who is that?" "My steward," Tobias said, his expression darkening further. "He's managed this estate's affairs since before I was born. If he's silencing the staff on Gideon's behalf, then this runs deeper than I thought." They found Corliss in the estate office an hour later, a narrow-faced man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that gave nothing away. He denied any knowledge of threatening the staff, denied any awareness of a stranger near the east gate, and maintained his composure so completely that Odessa found herself doubting the boy's account entirely, until she noticed the way Corliss's gaze kept flicking toward a locked drawer in his desk whenever Gideon's name was mentioned. "You're hiding something," she said quietly. Once Tobias had stepped out to speak with another servant, Corliss's composure cracked, just slightly, at being addressed so directly by someone he clearly considered beneath him. "I don't know what you imagine you've uncovered, Miss Hale, but I'd advise you to be careful where you place your suspicions. This estate has survived far worse than a village girl playing detective." "Is that a threat?" "It's advice," he said coldly. "The kind that's kept people in far more delicate positions than yours safely employed for years." Odessa held his gaze without flinching, though her heart was pounding. "I don't frighten as easily as you might hope." Something shifted behind his eyes, an irritation that bordered on alarm, and he turned back to his papers without another word. She left the office with her pulse still racing, more certain than ever that the locked drawer held something worth finding. She found Tobias in the garden later that afternoon, sitting on a stone bench near a fountain with Magnus stretched contentedly at his feet, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the manicured hedges. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression eased at the sight of her, the same way it had the night before in the gallery. "Corliss is protecting Gideon," she said, sitting beside him. "I'm certain of it now." "I suspected as much," Tobias admitted. "My father trusted Corliss above nearly everyone else. It's difficult to accept that trust may have been misplaced. People change when the person offering them power changes," Odessa said. "Or perhaps he was always loyal to whoever held the purse strings, and your father simply held them longer." Tobias was quiet for a moment, watching the water ripple in the fountain. "You see things clearly," he said finally. "It's rare. Most people who come into this house see only the title or the wealth, or what they might gain from being near it. You see the rot underneath, even when it isn't convenient." "I've had practice noticing what people try to hide," Odessa said. "Growing up with little means learning quickly who intends to help you and who only intends to use you." "And which am I?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more uncertain than she had heard it. The question hung between them, weighted with something neither of them had spoken aloud yet. Odessa looked at him, at the earnestness in his face, so different from the calculated coldness she'd seen in Gideon and Corliss both. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But you're the first person in a very long time who has asked me what I think, instead of telling me what to believe." Tobias reached down and rested his hand on Magnus' head, the dog leaning into the touch with a low, contented sigh. "My father used to say that Magnus could see people more clearly blind than most men could with perfect sight. He trusted animals more than people toward the end. I always thought it was grief talking." He paused. "Watching Magnus with you, I'm beginning to think he might have been right about something." Before Odessa could respond, a commotion erupted near the manor's side entrance, raised voices carrying across the garden. Tobias rose immediately, and they hurried toward the sound together, Magnus following close behind despite his blindness, his nose lifted and ears pinned in alarm. They found Mrs. Winch standing rigid in the doorway, her face pale, blocking the path of two men in unfamiliar livery, who carried themselves with the stiff formality of men accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "Your Grace," Mrs. Winch said, relief flooding her voice at the sight of him. "These men have come from the magistrate's office. They say there's been a formal complaint filed." "A complaint about what?" Tobias demanded. One of the men stepped forward, producing a folded paper with an official seal. "A complaint of trespassing and endangerment, Your Grace, filed against a Miss Odessa Hale, regarding an incident on the cliffs at Harlan's Ridge 2 nights past. Odessa's stomach dropped. That's absurd. I saved his dog's life. The complaint states otherwise, miss. The man said, not unkindly but firmly. It alleges you lured the animal toward the cliff edge deliberately, in an attempt to gain favor and access to this household. Tobias's face went white with fury. Who filed this complaint? The man glanced at the paper, though his hesitation suggested he already knew the answer would not be welcome. The complaint was filed by Mr. Gideon Ashwell, Your Grace. As a concerned family friend, acting in your best interest. The garden seemed to go silent around them, even the birds falling still, and Odessa felt the ground shift beneath her feet as surely as it had on the cliff 2 nights before. Except this time there was no one to pull her back from the edge. This is a lie, Tobias said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence in the garden. I was there. I witnessed exactly what happened. Miss Hale saved my dog's life at considerable risk to her own. Your Grace, I understand this is distressing, the magistrate's man said carefully, but the complaint has been formally filed. Miss Hale will need to appear before the magistrate to answer the allegations, or risk a warrant being issued for her arrest. Odessa's hands had gone cold, her mind racing through the impossibility of it all. She had pulled a dying dog from a cliff edge in a storm, and somehow that act of mercy had been twisted into a crime. When? Tobias demanded. 3 days from now, Your Grace. The magistrate's office in Bramwell. The men departed with a bow, leaving behind a silence thick enough to choke on. Mrs. Winch reached for Odessa's arm, steadying her, while Magnus pressed close against her legs, whining low in his throat as though he understood the danger circling the woman who had saved him. He's trying to remove me before I can prove anything against him, Odessa said once the men were gone, her voice steadier than she felt. If I'm facing a magistrate's complaint, no one will believe a word I say about Gideon or Corliss. I'll look exactly like what he claims I am, a liar seeking favor. He won't succeed, Tobias said, his jaw tight with a fury she hadn't seen from him before. I'll speak to the magistrate myself. I'll testify. Your testimony will help, Odessa said. But Gideon has clearly been planning this. He knew about my father before you told him. He had this complaint prepared and filed within a day. Men like that don't move quickly unless they've already decided the outcome they want. Tobias ran a hand down his face, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something close to helplessness cross his features. I won't let him do this to you. Then help me find proof, Odessa said. Real proof, not just suspicion. Corliss has something locked in that desk drawer. I saw the way he looked at it when Gideon's name came up. If there's evidence of what really happened at the gate, it's there. That night, long after the household had gone quiet and the manor settled into the particular stillness of a sleeping estate, Odessa found herself standing outside the estate office with Tobias beside her, a single candle throwing trembling light across the locked door. If we're caught, Tobias murmured, I can explain my own presence easily enough. Yours would be harder. Then we won't be caught, Odessa said, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Tobias produced a small ring of keys, ones he admitted his father had kept for emergencies, and after several tense attempts, one finally turned in the lock. The door swung open with a soft creak, and they slipped inside, Magnus padding silently behind them, his blindness somehow making him the quietest of the three. The desk drawer proved more stubborn, but a second key from the ring finally released the lock. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with plain string, along with a ledger that didn't match the estate's official records displayed openly on Corliss's shelves. Tobias untied the letters with steady hands, though his breathing had gone shallow. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp and hurried, and as he read the first page his expression shifted from confusion to something far darker. "These are from Gideon," he said quietly, "to Corliss, dated over the past 3 months. He read further, his voice dropping. "He's been paying Corliss to delay my marriage prospects. Every match I've been offered, every young woman who's expressed interest, Corliss has been quietly discouraging them, spreading rumors, inventing reasons for families to withdraw their daughters from consideration. Why would he go to such lengths?" Tobias flipped to another letter, and his face went pale as he read it aloud. "If the Duke remains unmarried past his 28th year, per the late Duke's private arrangement, control of the northern properties and their income reverts to Ashwell family management until an heir is produced. Gideon has been counting the days." "Your birthday," Odessa said slowly. "When is it?" 3 weeks from now." Tobias's hands were shaking now, the letters trembling in his grip. "He's not just trying to control who I marry. He's trying to ensure I don't marry at all before that date. If I remain unwed, he inherits management of nearly half this estate's income, indefinitely, until I produce an heir under his supervision." "And the gate," Odessa said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "If Magnus had died that night, and you'd been thrown into grief and mourning right as the deadline approached, you'd have had no thought of courtship at all. He wasn't just endangering your dog. He was trying to remove any chance of you finding happiness before your birthday. And when that failed," Tobias said grimly, "when you saved Magnus instead of him dying, and I began to care for you, Gideon needed a faster solution. Discredit you. Remove you from this house entirely before anything could grow between us." The ledger told the rest of the story in cold, precise figures, sums paid to Corliss over months, disguised as estate maintenance costs that never matched any actual repairs. It was more than suspicious now. It was proof, damning and undeniable, written in Gideon's own hand. A sound at the office door made them both freeze. Magnus' head snapped up, a low growl building in his throat, and Odessa blew out the candle just as footsteps approached down the hallway outside. The door opened, and lantern light spilled into the room, illuminating Corliss's stunned face as he found them standing amid his private papers. The evidence of his betrayal spread open on the desk before him. "You had no right," he said, his voice shaking with something between fury and fear. "I had every right," Tobias said, stepping forward with the ledger clutched in his hand. "This is my estate, Corliss. My father's arrangement, twisted into something he never intended. How long have you been taking Gideon's money to sabotage my own future?" Corliss's composure finally shattered completely, his shoulders sagging as though a great weight had been lifted, or perhaps finally settled fully upon him. 2 years, he admitted quietly. "He came to me after your father's death, and said the arrangement was meant to protect the estate from a young duke's foolish decisions. I believed him at first, then it became something else. Something I couldn't stop once I'd started. You endangered Magnus' life," Odessa said. "You endangered mine with that false complaint." "I had no part in the complaint," Corliss said quickly. "That was entirely Gideon's doing, I swear it. The gate, yes, I arranged for one of his men to leave it open, but I never intended real harm to come to the dog. I thought he'd simply wander the grounds and be found before any danger came to him. That's little comfort," Tobias said coldly, "to a blind animal who nearly died on a cliff edge because of your greed." He turned to Odessa, the ledger still clutched tight in his hand, determination replacing the shock in his eyes. "This proves everything. Gideon's motive, his manipulation, the truth behind the false complaint against you. Tomorrow, we take this directly to the magistrate ourselves, before Gideon has any chance to bury it further." Corlys said nothing more, standing defeated in the lantern light, and Magnus pressed himself against Odessa's side as though sensing that the danger, for tonight at least, had finally been named. But as they left the office with the evidence secured, Odessa couldn't shake the feeling that Gideon, cornered and desperate with only 3 weeks remaining before his scheme collapsed entirely, would not surrender so easily. Dawn had barely broken when Tobias ordered the carriage prepared, the ledger and letters secured in a leather case he refused to let out of his sight. Odessa stood beside him in the courtyard, Magnus pressed against her leg, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of what lay ahead settling heavily between them. "Corlys will not leave this house until the magistrate has heard everything," Tobias said. "I've had 2 footmen watching his door through the night. And Gideon? Still asleep in the east wing, as far as anyone knows." Tobias's jaw tightened. "He has no idea we found the letters yet. I intend to keep it that way until we're standing before the magistrate with proof in hand." They rode toward Bramwell in tense silence, the morning mist clinging to the hedgerows along the road, and Odessa found herself watching the countryside pass without truly seeing it, her mind turning over every possible way Gideon might still slip free of the trap closing around him. The magistrate's office sat at the edge of the market town, a squat stone building with narrow windows, and inside, an older man with tired eyes and silver hair listened to their account with growing astonishment as Tobias laid out the letters one by one across his desk. "This is a serious accusation, Your Grace," the magistrate said slowly, lifting one letter closer to the light. "Bribery of a household steward, deliberate endangerment, and now a false complaint filed to silence a witness. If these letters are genuine, Mr. Ashwell faces considerably more than the loss of his position in your household." "They're genuine," Tobias said. "Corlys has already confessed to arranging the gate. He'll testify to the rest, given the chance to save himself further consequence." The magistrate studied Odessa for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "And you, Miss Hale, maintain that the complaint filed against you is entirely false." "I saved that dog's life," Odessa said steadily. "I would swear it before anyone, under any oath you ask of me." Something in her voice must have carried conviction, because the magistrate's stern expression eased slightly. "I've known dukes to lie for far less noble reasons than protecting a woman who saved their dog," he said. "But I've rarely seen one bring evidence this thorough to defend the claim. Leave the letters with me. I'll summon Mr. Ashwell for questioning within the week." "Not the week," Tobias said firmly. "Today. If he learns we've been to the magistrate before he's formally questioned, he'll have time to flee or destroy further evidence." The magistrate considered this, then nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll send men to Deerholt this afternoon. But Your Grace, I must ask you to remain composed during the questioning. A duke's fury, however justified, will not serve this case well if it appears as though you've already decided his guilt before the law has spoken." The ride back to Deerholt felt longer than the ride there, dread coiling tighter in Odessa's chest with every mile. Magnus, sensing the tension radiating from both of them, refused to settle, his head lifting at every sound outside the carriage. They arrived to find the manor unusually quiet, servants moving through the halls with lowered eyes and hurried steps, and Mrs. Winch met them at the door with an expression that made Odessa's stomach drop before a word was spoken. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "Mr. Ashwell left an hour ago. He said he'd received word of urgent business and would return within a few days." "Corlys," Tobias said sharply. Did he speak with Corlys before leaving? I don't know, Your Grace, but Corlys is gone as well. The footmen watching his door said he slipped out sometime before dawn, before their shift even began properly. Tobias's face went white with fury, and Odessa felt the ground shift beneath her once again. The careful plan they'd built the night before crumbling in the space of a single sentence. He's known this whole time, Odessa said. Corlys must have warned him the moment we left the office. Send riders after them both, Tobias ordered, his voice cracking like a whip through the entrance hall. Every road leading from this estate, I want them watched. Gideon cannot be allowed to reach the coast or any port before he's found. Servants scattered to carry out his commands, and within the hour riders had been dispatched in every direction. The household thrown into a controlled chaos that mirrored the storm 2 nights before. Odessa stood at the window of the drawing room, watching the last of the riders disappear down the long drive, Magnus resting his head against her hand as though offering what comfort he could. He'll try to reach the coast, Tobias said, joining her at the window, his voice quieter now, some of the fury having burned itself into a colder, more focused determination. He has connections in shipping. If he escapes to the continent, the magistrate's reach ends at the water. Then we can't let him reach it. We won't, Tobias said. But I fear I've made this more dangerous for you than I intended. If Gideon believes he has nothing left to lose, he may not simply run. He may try to silence the one witness who could still testify against him even from abroad. Odessa turned to look at him fully, and the fear in his eyes wasn't for himself. It was for her, plain and unguarded, and something in her chest tightened at the sight of it. I'm not afraid of him, she said, though her voice trembled slightly on the words. I am, Tobias admitted quietly. I've already nearly lost Magnus once because of that man's greed. I won't stand by and risk losing you as well. The words hung between them, heavier than anything either of them had said before, and for a moment the danger circling the house seemed to fade into the background entirely. Magnus, ever perceptive despite his blindness, pressed himself between them, tail wagging slowly, as though sensing the shift in the air and approving of it wholeheartedly. Before either of them could speak further, a commotion rose from the courtyard below, shouts and the pounding of hooves against gravel. Tobias moved to the window instantly, and Odessa followed, her heart climbing into her throat at the sight below. One of the riders had returned, his horse lathered and breathing hard, and behind him, restrained between 2 other men, rode Corlys, his hands bound, his face pale with defeat. Tobias was down the stairs before Odessa could fully process what she'd seen, and she hurried after him, Magnus bounding ahead despite his blindness, guided entirely by the sounds and sense of the chaos unfolding in the courtyard. We found him at the crossroads Inn, Your Grace, the lead rider reported, dismounting swiftly. He hadn't gone far. Seemed almost relieved to be caught, if I'm honest. Corlys was pulled from his horse and brought before Tobias, his composure entirely gone now, replaced by something haggard and broken. I couldn't do it, he said before Tobias could speak. I couldn't run. Not after everything. I've served this family my whole life, and I let greed twist that into something unforgivable. I'll testify. Everything. Gideon's threats, his payments, all of it. Where is he? Tobias demanded. Where did Gideon go? The coast, Corlys said. He has a ship waiting at Faringate Harbor, arranged weeks ago in case his plans unravel. He left before I did. He'll be there by nightfall if the roads are clear. Tobias turned immediately to the rider who'd brought Corlys in. How far is Faringate from here? 3 hours ride, your grace, if the horses are pushed hard. Then we ride now, Tobias said, already moving toward the stables, his voice carrying an authority that sent servants scattering to prepare fresh horses. I'm coming with you, Odessa said, falling into step beside him. Odessa, this could be dangerous. If Gideon feels cornered, I've already been accused, threatened, and nearly ruined by that man, she said firmly. I intend to see this end with my own eyes, not wait behind these walls wondering what's become of it. Tobias studied her for a long moment, something between worry and admiration passing across his face, before he nodded once, a silent concession. Then we ride together. Magnus whined at the stable door, straining against the groom holding his lead, clearly sensing he was being left behind, and Tobias knelt briefly beside him, pressing his forehead against the dog's in a gesture of quiet reassurance. Stay here, he murmured. Guard the house. I'll return to you soon, I promise. The horses were brought out swiftly, and within minutes Odessa found herself mounted and riding hard alongside Tobias and a handful of his most trusted men, the afternoon light slanting gold across the fields as they raced toward the coast. The wind tore at her borrowed cloak, and her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. But beneath it all sat a certainty she hadn't expected to feel so strongly only days after a stranger's dog had nearly died in her arms. Whatever waited for them at Faringate Harbor, she intended to face it standing beside Tobias, not hidden away behind the safety of Deerholt's walls, and as the harbor came into view on the horizon, its ships swaying gently against a darkening sky, she knew with absolute certainty that the truth, once and for all, was about to be laid bare before them. Faringate Harbor smelled of salt and tar, the docks crowded with crates and coiled rope as fishermen and dockhands went about the last work of the day. Tobias led the party through the chaos with sharp, urgent eyes, scanning every ship for the one that mattered. There, one of his men called, pointing toward a merchant vessel near the far end of the pier, its sails already being raised, its crew moving with the hurried efficiency of men preparing to leave before the tide turned against them. They reached the gangway just as Gideon appeared on deck, a traveling case in hand, his fine coat replaced by something plainer, an attempt at disguise that had clearly failed. He froze at the sight of them, and for a moment something almost like relief crossed his face, as though a part of him had known this chase would end exactly here. Tobias, he said, setting the case down slowly. I see Corliss found his conscience rather inconveniently. Come down, Gideon, Tobias said, his voice carrying across the dock with unshakable authority. It's over, is it? Gideon's composure cracked at the edges, something wild and desperate flickering behind his eyes. You have no proof that would stand against a family name as old as mine. Letters can be forged. A steward's confession, extracted under duress, means nothing before a proper court. The magistrate has the letters in your own hand, Tobias said. Corliss has already confessed everything, freely, without threat. And Wren, the stable boy you thought too frightened to speak, described you clearly enough at the east gate the night you nearly killed my dog. Gideon's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward the open water beyond the harbor mouth, calculating, still searching for some escape even now. You endangered an innocent animal, Odessa said, stepping forward beside Tobias, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. You filed a false complaint to silence me. You spent 2 years poisoning every chance Tobias had at happiness. Also, you could seize control of what was never yours to take. I did what was necessary, Gideon snapped, his mask finally slipping entirely. His father made promises he never should have made. I was owed that inheritance long before you arrived with your ridiculous heroics and turned everything upside down. a village girl, playing savior, threatening 2 years of careful planning in the space of a single storm. You threatened a life that never belonged to you to control, Tobias said, his voice low and dangerous. Magnus trusted you. I trusted you. My father trusted you enough to let you into this family's confidence. And you repaid that trust by nearly killing the one creature he left behind for me to love. Something in those words seemed to land harder than anything else spoken, and Gideon's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him as the magistrate's men, summoned ahead by a second rider Tobias had dispatched from the crossroads, appeared at the far end of the dock, moving swiftly toward the ship. There's nowhere left to run, Gideon, Tobias said quietly. The tide won't save you now. Gideon looked between the approaching officers and the open water one final time, and whatever calculation remained in him finally collapsed under the weight of the inevitable. He didn't resist when the magistrate's men reached him, didn't offer another word of defense, simply allowed himself to be led down the gangway with the hollow expression of a man who had gambled everything and lost. You'll answer for the letters, the gate, and the false complaint against Miss Hale, the lead officer said, guiding him toward a waiting cart. The magistrate will determine the rest. As Gideon was led away, Odessa felt the tension that had gripped her for days finally begin to loosen, replaced by something closer to disbelief that it had truly ended, that the danger circling them since the night on the cliff had finally been named and contained. Tobias turned to her, the harbor light catching the exhaustion and relief mingled across his face, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the crowded dock fading around them until it felt as though they stood entirely alone. It's finished, he said quietly. It's finished, she echoed, though her voice caught slightly on the words. They rode back to Deerholt as the sun dropped low over the fields, the golden light softening the exhaustion of the day into something gentler, and Magnus was waiting at the manor's entrance the moment they arrived, straining against Mrs. Winch's hold until he was released to bound across the courtyard toward the sound of their approaching horses. Odessa dismounted and knelt as he reached her, burying her face briefly against his broad neck while he pressed close, his tail beating steadily against the gravel. And when she looked up she found Tobias watching them both with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, open and unguarded in a way that made her breath catch. He missed you, Tobias said softly. I missed him too, Odessa admitted, rising to her feet. The days that followed passed in a strange, quiet calm after the chaos of the chase. Corliss's formal testimony delivered before the magistrate, Gideon's fraudulent letters entered fully into record, and slowly, steadily, the shadow that had hung over Deerholt Manor for 2 years began to lift. Mrs. Winch moved through the halls humming softly again. Something Odessa hadn't realized had been missing until it returned, and even the portraits in the long gallery seemed to watch over the household with less severity now that the truth had finally been laid bare. Odessa found herself returning to the manor often in the weeks that followed, first to give her own testimony, then simply because Tobias asked her to, and because Magnus greeted her at the gates every time as though he'd been waiting the entire day for her arrival. It was on a golden afternoon, 3 weeks after Faringate Harbor, exactly the day Tobias's fateful birthday arrived and passed without any shadow of Gideon's scheme hanging over it, that she found him waiting for her in the garden where they'd first spoken so honestly of Corliss's betrayal. Magnus lay stretched in the sunlight nearby, utterly at peace, and Tobias rose the moment he saw her approaching, something nervous and hopeful written across his features that she had never seen from him before. I have something I need to ask you, he said, his voice unsteady in a way that made her heart begin to race. You seem nervous, Odessa said, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the sudden tightness in her chest. I've never seen a duke look quite so unsettled. I faced down a man determined to ruin my family and steal half my inheritance with steadier nerves than I have right now, Tobias admitted, and the honesty in it made her laugh softly, easing some of the tension between them. He stepped closer, taking her hands in his, and Magnus lifted his head from where he lay, ears turning toward them both as though he understood something important was unfolding. You saved his life on that cliff without knowing who I was, without any thought of what it might gain you, Tobias said. You stood beside me through everything that followed, not because it was safe or easy, but because you believed it was right. I have known duchesses who married for title and men who married for land, and I have never once in all my life wanted any of that. I only want someone who sees me the way you do, someone who sees Magnus the way you do, someone who chooses to stay, not because a storm brought her here, but because she wants to. He drew a small breath, his hands tightening gently around hers. Odessa Hale, he said, will you be my Duchess? For a moment, she couldn't speak at all, the weight of everything that had happened since that stormy night on the cliff rising in her chest, the fear and the danger and the quiet, unexpected tenderness that had grown between them through it all. She looked at him, at the sincerity written plainly across his face, and felt no hesitation at all. Yes, she said, her voice breaking slightly on the single word. Yes, I will. Tobias's face broke into a smile brighter than any she had seen from him, and he pulled her close, resting his forehead gently against hers the same way he so often did with Magnus, a gesture of trust and quiet devotion that meant more to her than any grand declaration could have. Magnus rose and pressed himself against them both, tail wagging steadily. His blind eyes turned toward the sound of their laughter as though he, too, understood that everything had finally found its way home. The wedding took place at Deerholt Manor beneath a sky washed clear and golden, the gardens filled with flowers and the halls bright with candlelight, and through it all, Magnus walked proudly at the front of the gathered guests, exactly where he belonged, beside the woman who had once pulled him back from the edge of a cliff and, in doing so, had found her way into a life neither of them could have ever imagined.